Hi, welcome everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. Just going to wait until I see a critical mass. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first session of the Affordable Housing 101 series. This April, we'll have 5 sessions covering the basics of affordable housing development. Today, we're starting off with the core elements of affordable housing development finance. And we have our 2 speakers today. Paul Biesmeyer, who is the managing director of financial consulting at the California Housing Partnership, as well as Chad Horsford, who is the associate director of financial consulting for the California Housing Partnership. And they will take it away in a minute, but I just want to remind everyone that as all SCANF webinars, we will have some time for Q&A at the end of the session. So please put all of your questions in the Q&A box. We'll be prioritizing the questions in the Q&A box first. So just put those questions in there and we'll get to those at the end of the session. And today's session, as all of our Affordable Housing 101 series will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel. And we will be sharing the slide deck as well. So look out for an email from me later today with all that information. But I'll give it off to Paul and Chad to get us started.
I said I was going to not forget to unmute myself, and yet I did. Hello, everyone out there in affordable housing land, and thank you, Danielle. I want to start by tipping my hat to SCAMF for standing up this affordable housing introduction series again. I think it's a really valuable service that SCAMF is performing for the affordable housing community at large, and we appreciate their leadership here. Secondly, I do want to emphasize Danielle's point that Chad and I will not be monitoring the chat for questions. We only have an hour. And so please, please, please put pertinent questions in the Q&A. If they are sort of housekeeping questions, Danielle's going to be monitoring those in real time, as well as housekeeping questions in the chat. But for content questions, hey, what about this project? Or my attorney told me X, and I'm hoping you can explain that. That's really something to put specifically into the Q&A. And we are going to do our best to wrap our presentation by 12:45, 12:50, so that we can take as many of those questions as we can. So with that, well, Danielle told you who we are, but we'll do a little bit more introduction in a second. But let's go to the next slide. And we would like to know a little bit more about who you are. So Danielle just opened a poll for us. And if you could just let us know which thing best describes you and your current relationship to affordable housing, and also how long you've been involved in the affordable housing world. So if you could just take a second and click buttons there, that'll help us get a sense of who's here. And Danielle, we're still seeing the poll screen. So I'm not sure if you've closed it out yet.
Nope, still going. Do you want me to close it out?
Let's give it 10 more seconds. How's that?
Sounds good.
Yeah, I think we should close it out now. If that's okay. Okay, and I'm going to assume that everyone can see the same thing I am right now, which is looks like we have uh, we have large concentrations of folks here from various government agencies, also folks who work for affordable housing developer owner operators, and a few folks who are involved in policy advocacy or research, some service providers. So welcome. I know there are many service providers out there who, over time have gotten into affordable housing development or have joint ventured and want to know more about affordable housing development. So welcome. This is a good learning space for that. And then, 25% other. So we have a lot of other, and if you are other, welcome. We welcome the diversity of other here. So let's close that out and we'll keep moving. And I will do, thanks, Chad. I'm going to do 25 seconds or ish on who the heck the California Housing Partnership is. So our mission is to create and preserve affordable and sustainable homes for Californians with low incomes by providing expert financial and policy solutions to nonprofit and public partners. And yes, I just read our mission statement, but we worked really hard on it. And so your question might be, well, what does that mean? Next slide, please. So what that really means is we are a California-focused nonprofit who was actually chartered by the state legislature back in the late 80s. And we are, I think the best elevator pitch is that the partnership is a think and do tank. And what do? We provide financial consulting services for affordable housing, including trainings like these. That's what Chad and I and our colleagues on the finance team do day to day. We also have substantial staffs who are on other teams who are doing policy research and implementation for affordable housing preservation and sustainable housing implementation. And we also have a number of housing data tools, and you have a link there that for some of you who don't know, who aren't aware of some of our data tools, those may be helpful to you, particularly for those of you in government. So that's the brief on who we are and what we do. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Chad for the top half of our presentation today. Thanks, Chad.
Hi, so welcome to everyone here today. Just to give us a quick overview on our agenda and where we'll be going with this presentation. I'll kick things off by sharing a bit about what affordable housing means and really drilling down to a definition we can take away from this presentation. From there, we'll go through a basic financial model for rental housing and just really broad overview of how housing works and what it takes to get it financed. We'll walk through some differences between market rate housing, which is what we'll cover in section 2, and affordable housing, which we cover in section 3. And just to give you a preview, the difference is subsidies. So in part 4, we'll talk about some subsidies in LA, California, and the US as a whole. So to start things off, what is affordable housing? Informally, you probably think, well, the definition is in the word itself. Affordable housing is housing that's affordable to someone. That's true. The difference is that we all have different definitions of what affordable means. It's a bit like when you get invited to a birthday dinner and your friend promises that it's an affordable place. We all have different tastes, and therefore affordable for one person may look very different than for someone else. To help drill down a common definition of affordable housing, where we often start is housing that costs no more than 30% of a household's income. And that's a definition you'll see within the policy realm, and it's made its way into just common knowledge by now. I remember graduating from college, and for a prepare yourself for the real world seminar, that's the definition they gave us to think about as we made our budgets. Within this realm, within housing policy and affordable housing policy, it's important to think about who we're talking about. So starting from housing that costs no more than 30% of a household's income, we really come in with a lens of focusing on low-income households. So we expand that definition to mean housing that costs no more than 30% of a low income household's income. So focusing on bringing in the who as well as the what. And then if we build that definition a step further, because as we saw from the attendees, we have a quarter of the group from government entities who have some control over how to implement this. We focus on housing that's legally required to cost no more than 30% of a low-income household's income. So we're building up this cake and adding more specificity within this definition. Paul?
Yeah, and Chad, I just wanted to add something for a couple things. It's based off gross income, not net. I think I was planning to answer that and someone threw it in the chat. But the other thing to know is that 30% of income, just for those who have been around a while, 30% of income, it feels chiseled into the tablets on Mount Sinai, but it's not quite. It used to be 25%. And that 25% standard for setting housing affordability, both in the private mortgage world, but also in setting rents and income eligibility in the affordable housing world. That changed what was sometime in the 80s. I'm forgetting exactly when. So I just wanted to make the point that it's these are the working definitions, but they have changed over time.
Yeah, that's a great point, Paul. And to help us a bit further, let's translate these words into numbers. So thinking about income in LA County, we're using 2023 data. So the median income for a one-person household is $84,000 for the year. And for a four-person household, presumably, you may have more than one income earner, or you may be dealing with someone who has been in their job a bit longer. The median income is $120,000 for the year. And in talking about median income, what we're really talking about is if you take everyone within a given group, the person who's exactly in the middle. So talking about income, that means 50% of the group earns more than this person and 50% of the group earns less than this person. So in this example, looking at a household of one with a median income of $84,000 for the year, if we take our affordable housing definition or affordable rent definition from the previous slide, if this household pays no more than 30% of their income toward rent, that means they can support paying up to $2,100 a month in rent. That's pretty good if you think about one person within LA County. For a household of four people, using the same 30% threshold, that means an affordable rent for them is anything up to $3,000 a month. If we start looking at deeper affordability levels or start being more specific about the groups we're talking about, these definitions that we'll go through, you'll see a lot in the policy literature where you see it thrown out low-income households, but no one ever defines what low income is within the paragraph you're reading. Well, low income in a lot of policy circles, you're talking about households that make 80% of median income. So 80% of this $84,000, which works out to roughly $66,000 for the year. At that income for a one-person household, an affordable rent is something that's no more than $16,050 for the month. So if you're a one-person low-income household, then your rental options shrink a little bit. You can't paying $2,100 a month in rent ends up working out to more than 30% of your income for the month. So if you're looking for an apartment, and are looking to pay an affordable rent, you have slightly less options. And that stays the same for a four-person household, where rather than paying $3,000 a month in rent and that being affordable, Now $2,400 is what would be affordable to you. If we dive a bit deeper, there's a category called very low income, which are households that make 50% of area median income. So again, going back to this median income concept, so 50% of the $84,000 a year, which works out to $42,000 for a year. And for households who are at the very low income level, an affordable rent to them would be anything up to $1,050 a month. And at that rental level, you really have a small pool of apartments to potentially look at if you're a one-person household. Further, there's extremely low income, which means 30% of area median income. So having an annual income of $26,000 a year and an affordable rent to you being no more than $660 for the month, which you can imagine would be really hard to find in LA County. That's where you're really making a lot of sacrifices in terms of what kind of housing you're looking at, the quality of it. You're making trade-offs where maybe you can't pay 30% of your income and afford a rental unit, and therefore you're paying above that, and you end up in a hard situation. Looking at affordability the other way, on this slide, we're going to walk through what average rents are in LA County currently. We pulled this data from Zumper based on March 2024 rent, so as of all of two days ago. So for a studio unit in LA, the average rent as of last month was $1,800 for the month. Again, if we assume that as long as a household is paying no more than 30% of their rent or of their income toward rent, that's affordable to them. That means a household needs to earn $72,000 for the year in order to support this rental payment. And if you look at area median income, that translates to if you're about 82% of area median income, then you're able to support this rental payment. So for households that are at area median income, they can comfortably support the average rent in LA County. However, that picture looks a bit differently for very low income households. So households that are earning 50% of area median income or less, in order to support a $1,800 a month rental payment for a studio unit, then you're paying half of your income toward rent, just about 49%. And that's a much different situation where you have less money to cover other needs and your budget becomes more tight. We see that as we go up in bedroom sizes. So as we start talking about 1-bedroom units, 2-bedroom units, or 3-bedroom units, the average rent increases. So you're presumably paying more toward rent. And if you look at 3-bedroom units in particular, the average rent skyrockets to $5,250 a month. That may in part be because if you look around at rental listings, there's a lot of studio and 1-bedroom units listed. I don't quite see as many 3-bedroom units listed. So focusing on 3-bedroom units, in order to support affordable rental payments of $5,250 a month, you'd have to be earning $210,000 for the year in order for these rental payments to be no more than 30% of your income. That's a huge amount. We're comparing it to the average median income. That means you have to earn 67% more than the median income in order for the average 3-bedroom rent to be affordable to you. And if you look at very low income households in particular, essentially you have to take all of the income you earn in order to just pay rent on the average 3-bedroom unit. So for very low income households looking to have 3 bedrooms who have larger families, it becomes very hard to afford the average large unit in LA County. And that's by and large why we focus on this last piece of housing that's legally required to cost no more than 30% of a low income household's income, because that's where there's a lot of need. Paul?
Chad, would you mind going back to the previous slide?
Yeah.
So I want to address a question in this space that has come up from time to time when I've done briefings for, political staffers or for boards of directors of organizations that are thinking of getting into affordable housing. And that question goes something like, oftentimes it's based on personal experience. Someone being introduced to this for the first time might sit back, someone in our audience today might be sitting back and saying, well, shuckins, I'm paying more than 30% of my income towards rent or towards a mortgage or total housing costs, let's say. And that may well be true. So a couple things are true. There is a huge shortage of probably 500,000 units in Los Angeles County alone to meet the affordability needs. So by definition, that means that there are many low-income people out there in Southern California, in Scamp's service area, who are paying more than their rent. But I want to come back to this 30% notion. And I would submit that part of the policy thinking behind setting the limit at 30% as defining the threshold of affordability, even though many of us are probably paying more than 30% of our gross income towards housing costs, is because think of it in terms of your own monthly budgeting, your own day-to-day finances. The more that you have, chances are the more cushion you have, the more your spending is about choices. I'm choosing to do a vacation or not do a vacation. I'm choosing to get the new car lease or not get the new car lease. But the less income that you have, the more night and day, the more dire those choices become. So it's not a paying, if you're paying half of your income, it's the choice between, and you're in the very low income stratum that Chad was just talking about. Well, then it's not a choice between doing something voluntary and involuntary. It's a choice between housing or food, or housing or food or medication or childcare. So I think that's part of part of the framework that folks should keep in mind, is that 30% threshold becomes especially important when we're talking about low income folks, as opposed to people who are earning a little bit more. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to touch on, Paul. And I could have personal experience here where I grew up in a very low to extremely low income household. If something happened where my mom wasn't able to work for a couple of days, that meant less food for the month, or just not getting a basic necessity. Nowadays, I earn more than my mom earned growing up. If I have an unexpected expense, that means I'm not putting as much money into my savings account. And those are two very different realities and how this plays out month to month, depending on income level. So to go on a bit, in the second section, we're just going to briefly walk through a basic rental housing financial model for how putting together a market rate deal may look. So in our example development, which is very oversimplified, we're going to assume that we have 50 units in a building. Each unit is paying $4,000 a month in rent. Building expenses work out to about $6,000 a year per unit. And the cost of developing the building is going to be $600,000 per unit. So the total development cost for a building or 50-unit building works out to $30 million. Again, this is very oversimplified, nice round numbers, which I love. So at $4,000 $4,000 per month in rent. That works out to being affordable to households roughly around the $160,000 income mark, for 127% of the median income for a 4-person household. Of course, that works out to being a bit more as a percentage of income as you go down the income spectrum. So for an extremely low income household, it's unsustainable where it's more than 100% of what an extremely low income household would make. But based on $4,000 rents per unit, a 50-unit building can generate about $2.4 million in income a year. We're starting in year 1, and we assume that their rental increases every year, so that number would go up year by year. At $6,000 per unit in operating expenses, you'd have $300,000 in operating expenses, and at the end of the day, after the building owner collects income and pays their expenses, in year 1, you have net operating income, so money that's free to use, of $2.1 million. And we see that increases year by year as income and expenses increase as well. In our very oversimplified model, we presume that the building owner is able to basically pay themselves back for the cost of developing the building. And over time, they're able to generate a return on their investment. So in this model, around year 9, that's when they break even and then they generate profit. And in order to incentivize building the development, they're targeting a return of investment of around 8%. So the big picture story is the building owner is able to pay themselves from their operating income and recoup their initial investment. In the real world, this picture looks a bit more complicated, where rather than a building owner just pocketing $2.1 million, they probably leverage a loan in order to minimize the amount of capital they're putting up front. And they'll have loan payments to make. But at the end of the day, they'll always have some money, which they're pocketing to return the cost of their investment. And more often than not, after a couple years of operations, they're probably selling the building to someone like a real estate investment trust who wants the year on year steady cash in order to recoup their investment in a shorter amount of time. So based on 50 units and $4,000 a month in rent and $6,000 per year in expenses, we're roughly estimating that as an investor, you'd raise $30 million for the upfront cost of development. Now we'll walk through a bit of how this is different for an affordable housing development, and Paul will do that.
Thanks, Chad. So where we're headed here is answering the question, the existential question for the partnership anyway, why do you people have a job that's just doing affordable housing finance consulting? And the reason is it's complicated. So in our previous example, we don't need to go back to it, Chad, but in our previous example, granted, it's very, very simplified, but if I'm a market rate developer, I'm going out and I'm putting together a creative debt stack that's supported out of that ultimately will be supported out of the property's net operating income. Maybe I'm doing multiple tranches of debt. I have some mezzanine debt. I mean, I'm getting creative because debt is cheaper than equity. And then, you know, out of my $30 million, I can support what I can support out of debt. And then for the balance, I am doing my darndest not to reach into my own pocket, and I'm going to an equity investor. I'm going to CalPERS. I'm going to any number of investment vehicles. I might be going to a sovereign wealth fund or something like that for my equity investment. And that is my stack, my finance stack. It's debt, with varying strips of debt and different degrees of complication, and equity also with its own complication. So those are they're large numbers. They're relation, there's a lot of relationship building and trust that goes into getting them. So I'm not saying that is simple, but it's putting together everything else that's required to close, to pay that $30 million on an affordable development that keeps us chickens here employed, and also is one of probably 2 or 3 key, incredibly tough friction points in developing and executing affordable housing. So could we have the next one, Chad? And maybe the next one too. Thank you. So, so we want to take the same theoretical development, and I should say, really a market rate development. No market rate developer, for the large folks anyway, are going out and building 50-unit multifamily properties. They're building hundreds of units at a time because there is economy of scale to be gained there. However, we're trying to keep the numbers on the small side and easy to digest. And even for affordable development, we're still looking for what is more economically viable. So typically developments are a little bit larger than that, but not all. So anyway, but we're going to stick with our 50-unit example. So tacking back to the examples that Chad was giving of affordable rents, for the very low income affordable rent is only $1,500 per unit per month versus $4,000. And on top of that, the operating expenses per unit per year are probably, not always, but probably a little bit higher. And that's due to a couple reasons. One is affordable developments do tend to be a little bit smaller than market rate developments, primarily due to both availability of capital and political acceptability in citing a project, but also because we are, the more deeply affordable a property is, the more it's required and or just a good idea to make sure that you have service providers attached to the property who are helping folks who are very low income to manage finances, connect with childcare, and stay housed and stay stable. So expenses a little bit higher, but looky here on the per unit development cost line. Well, development costs are all the same, and I should say here, I want to put rest the notion that affordable housing is too expensive. Well, it might be, but it doesn't really cost any more. That statement should really be housing is too expensive in California, because research has proven, and the partnership just put out a newsletter a couple months ago, I believe, on this point, that there are no significant differences, statistical differences between the cost of developing market rate units versus affordable units. And the cost drivers are a little bit different if you pick them apart. So sure, market rate development might have slightly larger units, might be a little bit better amenitized, better finishes, and have some more common amenities. I don't know, a weight room and more parking, et cetera. On the affordable side, it tends to be, the amenities aren't fancy, but they need to be durable. But you also have a lot of other cost drivers on the affordable side. So most often we are paying some kind of wage scale. It might be federal Davis-Bacon wages, it might be California state prevailing wages, or it might be required to be union. And there's no judgment here or there, but it can be a cost driver. And also, often in affordable housing, there are other elements that are part of the housing build, community benefits type space, that are required and are a product of the community acceptance process, and they cost money. And so, in any event, net, at the end of the day, we end up with very similar development costs between market rate and affordable development. And just to take the example one step further, if we are making all of our 50 units available to extremely low income households, those who are at 30% or less of the area median income, well, the affordable rent for them is only $600 per unit per month. And because it's a very deeply affordable project, we probably have to have more higher service costs, more services staff to help folks stay successfully housed. So we're making a whole lot less in revenue, just purely dollars and cents. There's a lot less revenue, expenses are higher, and yet it costs us virtually the same to build it. So let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Chad. So to run those examples out, and again, I want to mention, folks, we are not monitoring the chat. So if this is a talk amongst yourselves, Linda Richmond kind of thing, cool. But Chad and I aren't watching and responding to the chat in real time because we don't have enough time for it. So again, back to our cash flow examples. Our very low income, our property targeted to very low income is making has net operating income that's about a quarter of our market rate property. And oh my gosh, by golly, if we look at our extremely low income property, well, that thing doesn't even cash flow. It doesn't even break even. It's in the red from day one. And it doesn't matter if it's affordable housing or not, it still has to break even. It has to cash flow. We have to be able to pay core operating expenses. And so what do we do in an example like that? And there are a lot of permanent supportive housing developments targeting the unhoused that are in a situation that looks somewhat like that. And the answer there is that we are going out and using all of our skills and all of our connections, we are lining up some sort of additional subsidy to provide annual operating or rent support to prop up the operations of the building. So let's go to the next slide, I believe. Yeah. So actually, could you go back one, Chad? If you don't mind. So I just want to let's focus on that net operating income line. So market rate development, $2.1 million in net operating income, and that is going to support a bunch of debt. And then what's remaining is going to be peeled off to provide a cash on cash return to an equity investor. A very low income property, on the other hand, has only a quarter of the income. There is not much to go around. And likewise, on the extremely low income property with the operating subsidy, in our example, there's a little bit more to go around, but it's certainly not going to be enough. So if you take nothing away from this development, from this presentation, I'm sorry, I would focus on slide 17. If you're a political staffer, that's one to show to your boss. Say, look, the basic problem. In a market rate development, we're balancing NOI with interest rates and investor rates of return to see if it works. There is the economics of affordable housing. The deeper you target, the less there is to go around, the less net operating income you have. And that's why we turn to the various subsidy sources that we're going to talk about in just a second. Let's go to the next one. So the place that everybody will turn first, of course, whether you're a market rate developer or an affordable developer, will be debt, will be a mortgage. How? We have some net operating income, so what can we support? And as long as cash flow in general, I'm generalizing, this is all generalizing, but if we can reasonably project that cash flow will increase over time, then a lender, a bank, or an agency lender lending on behalf of Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or even HUD FHA will offer various mortgage products with 15 to up to 40-year amortization, using debt service coverage as low as 1.15. So let's go to the next thing. Let's do the next one too. Thank you. So going back to our examples, our very low income, our 50 unit project targeted only to very low income folks, with a 20-year mortgage, 20-year term, 20-year amortization at roughly current market interest rates, we're only able to borrow about $5 million. And if you think back to our example, it's costing us $30 million to build this thing. So and at a 1.15 debt service coverage ratio, we're using darn near all the money that's available to support the debt. There is not much left to pass around to a cash equity investor. Thanks, Chad. And I think I want to continue my role by booking past this slide. Yeah. So here's the basic problem. And this is a great little encapsulation, I think. If the rents are required to be affordable to low-income households, subsidy is going to be needed to cover development costs, subsidy of some sort from somebody. And sometimes, if the income targeting is low enough, sometimes even operating costs. And so what are the solutions? Well, internationally, there's a wide variety of approaches. Social housing with a real income mix is a very established thing in parts of Europe, for example, in Austria and France, in Scandinavia. But we're not international. We're right here in the good old US of A. So let's talk about what we're doing here. So where do we go for that subsidy? Here in the States, most affordable housing, not all, but most affordable housing today is financed by, first of all, a mortgage, a permanent loan, sort of in the parlance. The second major thing is equity gained through the syndication of a federal tax subsidy, so the low-income housing tax credit. And finally, additional gap funding from different levels of government, city, county, state, or federal. And so we're going to round out the presentation here by talking about, well, shuckins, where do all those subsidies come from? If you're a city council or supervisorial staffer, a constituent comes to you and says, I own a piece of land, I want to develop housing. Gosh, I can't, I want to make it affordable to people in the neighborhood, and I can't get there through my supportable through a mortgage. So what do you have for me? Well, that they're coming to talk to you about gap financing. And so we're gonna let's break this down. So where are these subsidy sources? So first, let's talk about the not simpler, but the quicker is subsidy for operations. There are the primary. So think back to our example of the extremely low income property that was negative, had negative cash flow from day one without a renter operating subsidy. Rental subsidies are primarily the province of the federal government. It's primarily different flavors. It's the old line PBRA Section 8 program. It's also the Housing Choice Voucher program, and also the Continuum of Care, formerly known as the Shelter Plus Care program. But the basic idea there is a tenant pays 30% of their income, no matter how low their income is, and that the subsidy pays the balance of rent due up to a fixed amount, usually indexed in one way or another to local fair market rents. And there are other options out there, like there's a self-help local funding that's happening here in my backyard in LA County through the Department of Health Services Flexible Housing Subsidy Program. But let's move over to capital. And so in terms of capital subsidies for development, the primary place, again, the primary engine for affordable housing development across the country since the Tax Reform Act of 1986 has been the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. You can love it or hate it. You can criticize it. You can revile it. You can embrace it like a long lost brother. But the fact of the matter is, it's one of the largest single sources of indirect capital subsidy for affordable housing creation. And the idea is that instead of that, we're creating affordable housing through the tax code by passing on tax shelter to investors. So rather than the federal government writing a dollar for dollar check, as it used to do with, say, the old 202 program way back in the day, then instead the feds are providing tax incentive. So it's a tax expenditure. It still costs the government money, but it's done indirectly. So instead of providing annual cash flow to an investor is enticed to invest to become part of the ownership of a property so that they can receive 10 to 15 years of tax benefits. And this is both the low-income housing tax credit and the passive losses, or the deductions and therefore passive losses that would come with any investment property. And what do they get so they get those tax benefits, and in exchange they contribute money to the developer, to the partnership that owns the property, or the LLC, and they are on the hook also to help guarantee the project's ongoing compliance, to be, if you will, a financially motivated third party, a financially motivated big brother who's going to make sure that the property stays in compliance and continues to be available for people at the income levels for whom it's intended. And the amount of the low-income housing tax credit, it's not rocket science. It's not even algebra 2, but it is formulaic, and it's based in part on the project's eligible costs. And it is, I guess the main thing to know is it's not designed to cover 100% of the costs of a project. The low-income housing tax credit will raise equity to cover somewhere between 40 and 60%. And so if we've got a loan that's covering, in most cases, a maximum of 15 to 25, a mortgage, I should say, it's covering 15 to 25% of total development cost, and low-income housing tax credit equity that's covering the other 50, well, where do we go for the remaining, say, 25% or more? And that is our other gap funding. So that's different levels of funding through public agencies, sometimes through philanthropy, that most typically comes in the form of a soft loan, that is a loan for which there's a promissory note and a deed of trust, but for which payments are only due if there's cash flow available to pay them. Let's do the next slide. And so I'm going to give you the greatest hits list of all the examples of types of things that are available, the sort of word salad of resources that are available if you're developing here in where Chad and I are located in LA County, or more broadly, elsewhere in California. I'm not going to spend time talking about these because that's 3 hours in and of itself, and we wouldn't do them all justice. But the point is, there are a lot of different levels of government with different types of programs. Some of them are administering their own self-help funds. So, for example, the Proposition Triple H funds here in the city of Los Angeles. Others are administering pass-through funds from the federal government or even from the state in the form of the PLHA, Permanent Local Housing Allocation. So let's go to the next slide. But I think it's worth understanding the characteristics of public funding, of what these public funding sources are. So, and when I talk about public funding sources, I'm not just talking about the word salad I threw at you, but also the low-income housing tax credit. So things to know. The first thing to know is that they are always competitive. There are always, almost always, 99-point-something% of the time, there are more eligible projects than available funds. And so there is some kind of competitive ranking system. And that dollars drive behavior. And so every program has its own incentives that differ sometimes among funders. Each program has its own requirements around public benefit, primarily around housing affordability. But there may be additional public benefits that a program's to cause to be contributed to a community. So that may be additional requirements around labor, environmental standards, design, relocation, to mitigate displacement, and so forth. And one last thing is there is often a requirement that incentivizes either cost or resource efficiency. And so, yeah, cost and or resource efficiency. So sometimes programs will have an emphasis on make sure somebody else's money is committed. In order for you to be maximally competitive, we want lots of that guy's money committed before we commit our money. And so that's another kind of common characteristic. Next slide. Yeah, let's click through. Okay. Thank you. So where I want to leave you is what does so back to our examples here, and I am realizing now there's a typo that I want to correct. I'm not going to correct it in real time, but the market rate example on the left should be $30 million. So we have 3 different $30 million examples. The market rate example is covering its nut, if you will, with cash flow and the combination of a mortgage, combination of mortgage and equity investment. Our very low income property, again, targeted to folks only at 50% of area median income, is only getting 5 million in a mortgage, 11 million from equity investment, and then it's going and securing another $14 million of other funding from city, county, state. Okay. And then in our extremely low income example, because of the benefit of the operating subsidy or the rent subsidy, they're able to borrow a little bit more. So they're able to support a $7.5 million mortgage rather than 5, but they're still going out hat in hand and having to compete for about $12.5 million of local city or state funding. So let's go to our last slide, and then I'm a little bit over time and we'll pause for questions. So that's the blitzkrieg through housing affordability and financing sources, but it's a decent place to start. And I hope it sets everyone up well to move forward in this training series that SCAMP has. And the big takeaways we want folks to have are that 1, not enough people are served by market rate housing, and you can find a lot of more deep research on that on both SCAMP's and the partnerships websites. Also, housing that is required to be affordable for lower income people does not generate enough cash flow to pay for upfront development costs, and public funds are what makes this public good financially feasible. And that's where I'll stop and pop it back to Danielle.
Thanks, Paul. And just a reminder to everyone, this recording and slides will both be available after the session. I'll be sending an email out with both of those materials, so you will have access to these later today. But let's get into Q&A because we have a few minutes. We have a lot of questions, so I'm not sure if we'll get into everyone's questions, but we'll try and get through as many as possible. So the first question, and actually I'm seeing this question come up a couple times, why would you be calculating gross income versus net income?
I saw that pop up several times, and I apologize, folks. I can't answer that. I used to know the answer. And Chad, Chad has been teaching a class at UCLA for a couple of years with enterprising grad students who probably challenge him on all sorts of things. Have you had to answer this question recently?
It's a question I've asked myself. And it's one of those things where I think initially it's something that snowballed, where initially it just got accepted, and you'll see debate in policy papers back and forth between gross and net. And yeah, I agree with what I'm seeing here, and that makes a lot of sense. But we've held on to gross as the calculation, and I don't think there's a particular rhyme or reason, but I do want to acknowledge that there's some dissonance there.
I'll bet you that somebody at, it's just not a question I was ready to answer, but I'll bet you anyone at National Low Income Housing Coalition or the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities could answer that in a flash.
Another question kind of about the 30% affordability. Does that include only rent or also utilities?
Fab question. So the 30% housing affordability in the affordable rental sense, in the, in the affordable rental universe, it's meant to cover total housing costs, and total housing costs are here defined as rent and utilities and any mandatory tenant payments. So for example, if you had a building where every unit, an affordable building where every unit came with, every apartment, I should say, came with a parking space, but it wasn't optional to pay for it. The tenant had to pay an extra $100 a month for that parking space. Well, the cost of that mandatory charge would also be factored into the rent payment. It would be calculated into their total housing payment and ultimately what they were required to pay to the landlord.
Thanks. Next question. How do you calculate the projections up to 15 years? There was I remember a training that we had internally for our staff years ago with the CPA and some really complicated tax things. And he kept saying, well, that's a good question. It's through the magic of accounting. And so a 15-year cash flow projection is something like that. And sometimes in our world, these cash flow projections go out to something that feels even sillier, like 30 years or 50 years or 99 years occasionally. But the principal idea is that we are assuming that income will grow at a certain rate over time, that incomes and area median incomes, and therefore rents will grow over time. But expenses are also going to grow over time because of inflation. And we are always assuming that the expense rate of increase is greater than the rate of income increase. So what does that mean? We're probably assuming that our income grows somewhere between 2 and 2.5%, between 2 and 2.5% per year. But we're assuming that expenses are growing between 3 and 3.5% per year. So eventually, if you run out your cash flow long enough, those numbers are going to come together and they're going to invert. And the question is, when do they invert? And also property operations, I think if we were being real here among friends, I think people who actually operate property would say that it's something like war, that your battle plan goes out the window when the first shot is fired. I think that once people start operating property, a property, sometimes the reality of what it costs to operate can be very different from what was projected up front. And we do our darndest to make sure that disconnect doesn't happen, but it does happen sometimes. And we've particularly seen that be the case with as more and more owner operators have gotten into developing homes for the unhoused who don't have experience running buildings for the unhoused, and have discovered that it costs a lot more to operate those units, to provide all the service staffing, et cetera, than they intended or than they thought. Thank you. Next question. Do the added debt equity sources add costs to affordable housing that private developers don't face?
I can start this, where I think the biggest additional cost is time. Where one thing we didn't touch on, but I think will be covered in the other series, are when you look at the financing stack and the market rate side, you have just the debt and equity. On the affordable side, it's not just that there's a big bucket of public funding, but it's you're going to the city, you're going to the state, you're maybe going to the federal government as well. And all of that is costing you time. So maybe you put in a city application this year, there's a state application 8 months down the line. And while you're waiting to figure out, because all these sources are competitive, you may not get it the first try. And during that time, your cost of construction is going up just due to inflation and cost escalation. And the amount of time it takes you to gather up all the funding you need to start development. You may start presuming one budget number, and 2 years down the line, when you actually start construction, your construction costs are 20% higher.
And that is absolute, just to append to that, that is absolutely what we saw in the most stark terms possible for properties that were trying to line up gap subsidy, capital subsidy resources during the pandemic. So we were making the round robin of applications, some winning, some losing in 2020 and 2021. And lo and behold, 2022 came around. We had developments that finally were able to grab the brass ring and get their resources. And wouldn't you know it, there were hashtag inflation. The world had changed, and their assumptions were no longer valid. And so that produced its own scramble. And that was purely, those examples are fresh in mind, very painful, and purely the result of having to wait around through bridge to bridge two different economic realities over time, because we had to apply for, wait and apply to resources, excuse me.
Thank you, Chad and Paul. Unfortunately, we have hit our time, so that's gonna be our last question. But thank you everyone for attending. Again, thank you, Chad, Paul, and to the California Housing Partnership for helping us SCAMP out with this webinar today. I just want to remind everyone that our next webinar will be next Tuesday, April 9th from 1 to 2 p.m. and we'll be covering the economics of affordable housing developments, specifically long-term affordability and cost drivers. And if you didn't get an email about signing up for it yesterday through the SCAMP email, I would urge you to sign up for our newsletters, and I'll be sending more emails with links to sign up for that webinar later this week and next week. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.